Great. Well, thank you very much for that. So in the usual format, I think both presenters will talk for sort of 15, 20 minutes each, and then we'll have time for discussion and debate and questions at the end. So I'm handing over now to Maria-Teresa. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Seven, for hosting us. And thank you. These are talks organized by Everything is Connected with the collaboration of UAL, LCC, Park, and every time, as you know, I have a guest speaker, which helps me to get deeper in the conversation about the specific topic we talk about. You can find the previous talks on our website, everythingisconnected.eu. And today we'll talk about trans-disciplinarity. And I have the honor to have with me a guest speaker, very experienced and very knowledgeable, that is David Cross, which is, as Paul was saying, is a reader of fine art at the UAL, University of the Arts, London. So I will do an introduction myself first, and then I'll leave the word to David. So thank you for joining us, and we will have some space at the end for Q&As and questions if you guys want to. So let me open my presentation. Okay, so these are the topics we will talk about today, if I manage to go ahead. 1 second. Okay. Of course, a lot of important discovery around all this idea of visualizing the environmental emergency, which is the series of talks we've been having in the past months. I've been addressing a few different issues, so I won't repeat myself. So really, you will find a lot of background information also in the past talks. So today I will go a little bit deep down into the role of art in addressing the environmental emergency, the role of science, how art and science have been working together in the past years, really, but also more in recent years, recent months even. How artists should maintain fidelity to their own work, to the climate data. We'll see that this is a relationship that probably needs a lot of attention. And we will kind of open discussion around what disciplines are fundamental in order to be effective in communicating the climate emergency, if it's just science and art, or we need to involve a lot of other disciplines as well, with some conclusions. So as we know, just a brief introduction, environmental art is not something new, but the environmental art, if we want, or the environment, or the, you know, we could call it environmental visual art, photography, whoever, is kind of is an umbrella term that talks about the ability of art to address human relationship to the natural world. And as we know, this relationship has evolved, has changed over the years, and as a consequence, the visualization of it has changed. So we are not telling much new in terms of the idea of artists developing projects that actually depict this relationship. But in today visual culture, probably that relationship needs to be reviewed, because the issue about communicating climate change is very complex, multifaceted, and so needs different approaches, in my opinion. So as we know, the role of photography, in this presentation, I will talk about photography and visual art almost like as synonymous. There isn't, I won't focus specifically on photography. I know that most of the people that follow us are photographers, but we need to go a little bit broader than that. So as we know, photography and photojournalism are considered universal language. So they are very important to interpret data and to give back a visualization of this data in a language that is easily understood by people. So an image can tap into a very primal emotion, and so help the process of going deeper in understanding the issue, and in a way inspire people towards a cultural shift, which is kind of what we are really trying to do. So as we're saying, of course, visual art is considered an important catalyst for disseminating climate science data. I remember our first conversation with David Cross, where about, I remember him keep saying it's evidence. And every scientist will tell you that it's evident. Data, it's like under the eyes of everyone at the moment. And no one can say, today, no one can say that we don't know what's going on. But knowing or evidence is not necessarily a driving force that lead people into actually doing some changes. So while visual art can do that, imagine if you see in a public space a lot of documents about, documents about specific data, or if you see a piece of art which are an interpretation of that. And that's the kind of delicate relationship we need to investigate today. So as we've seen in the past, art and photography have the capacity to create a personal connection, as we were saying. So a personal connection to a topic that is very complex, can expand individual awareness regarding climate change, can engage on a local level and show the connection between far and close. This idea of local is becoming kind of urgent, because we've seen that in the past, most of the communication or visual representation of the environmental emergency was related to areas that are far from us, areas that happens in most vulnerable countries. And this has led to a detachment from the story. So working on a local level, or even better, showing the connection between what happens to faraway places and our everyday life would be probably more efficient and effective. And of course, visual art can be a tool for disseminating complex information to a large public. So let's start with this premise about art. I won't go too far, because we've been talking extensively in the past talks on in what ways art can be used to create connection and empathy with the public. I wanted also to make another premise, so we know where we all can start from, and it will be a very kind of a brief introduction. There is a large consensus today among the scientific community that climate change is real. So because now there is a lot of attention and artists working with the topic, the broad topic of climate change, we need to know that what we are trying to do with these projects. And so some of the scientific assumptions are the following. It's warming, we know. We have to stay, apparently, within the 1.5 degrees Celsius within 2030, and while now we are at 1.18, I think. It doesn't feel like it's a lot, but in some places this is becoming already a major issue in terms of difference between life and death for a lot of people. It's been proven also that human activities are at the base of climate change, especially for the burning the fossil fuels. And so the rising of temperature are directly correlated to the release of greenhouse gases. We are sure there is like 97% of a consensus among the scientific community about the connection between human activities and climate change. And but there has been an investment of millions from lobbies and oil companies that since the 2015 Paris Agreement have been investing into trying to create uncertainty around the climate change, because of course they are lobbies that work with politicians in order not to change the status of the investment, the public investment in their own activities. It's bad, we know that. At the moment we are at 1.18 degrees Celsius, which is already creating some devastating impacts in terms of extreme heat, ocean warming and acidification, storms and violent weather events in many places around the world, sea level rise and melting ice, and the crisis of a lot of habitats and the biodiversity. And the kind of the good news, or the semi-good news, is that we can fix it in terms of we need to not to keep investing, we need to stop using fossil fuels and to transition to 100% renewable energy. And of course, we know that this doesn't really depend on individuals. It depends on politicians, corporations, and policymakers that actually invest into this renewable energy. But there is a lot, and this is obviously open to discussion, because it's a big kind of narration about what can individual do. And I think we can help activate a cultural shift towards a more sustainable living by reducing consumption of unsustainable food, reduce the use of disposable plastic, recycle, reuse, reduce a lot of things that actually are not good for the environment, and in a way create a critical mass that then is able to influence the point one, so the policymakers, politicians and corporations to conduct their investment towards greener and more just world. So within this premise, art and science in the past years, as I said before, have been producing a lot of interesting works and joining forces to convey important messages. So this is an art installation for trees. There is at the moment like the global deforestation is around 20,000 trees cut per minute. And so like this is a kind of installation that invites visitors to listen to the evolving tempo of deforestation. So you can like hear the sound, which is pretty impressive. I will share these links into the chat box after, because it's good that you have a look a bit more deep into this project. This is an exhibition called Life by Olafur Eliasson. He has put like plants and bio elements at the center of his research, rather than just being human centric. So he has created this kind of emphasize the colors and the presence of plants and like vegetables. As a way to and giving them a proper place. Ooh, sorry, can you giving place and giving even them like different names, so turning names like into verbs, so not just trees but to tree. So it's a way to force a reflection on how all the elements are connected, and the humans are just one part of all the elements that represent the planet. Particular Matters by Tomás Saraceno is an architect, but also an artist from Argentina. He has created all this around the idea of the web and the spider. He has created a network in which people can really understand how everything is interlaced and interconnected. And he works in this project as an activist, as an arachnophile, as an architect, an activist, a teacher, a musician, an environmentalist, and of course putting all the skills together from himself, but also from other people, to create a kind of a conscious installation about social justice and the idea of clean air. I really recommend you to see the installation. He's done a lot of things also in the desert of Atacama, and they are all pretty impressive, and they invite people to participate. This is another work by street artist Sean Ioro, also known as Hula. He's created a series of murals. In this case, are like temporary murals painted on icebergs that were just broken off. And he says that I witnessed the extreme melting rate firsthand, as the sound of ice cracking was a constant background noise while painting. Within a few weeks, these murals will be gone, but for those who find them, I hope they ignite a sense of urgency, as they represent the millions of people in need of our help, who are already being affected from the rising sea levels of climate change. So as we've seen, art and science well, these are projects that really involves other disciplines. In fact, the art and science have been working, as we said before, for many years together, but probably they are not enough. I think we need an integration for scientists and artists, of course, but also the work, especially if we want to bring these projects to the public and to the public space, in order to be not just a niche consumption, but actually at the service of a large public that usually don't have access to certain kind of topics and content. We need also the involvement of institutions, of architects, of urban planners, mass media, educators, sociologists, researchers in many areas, so anthropologists and so many others, to respond to the challenges of climate change, and so to inspire to have a richer conversation, new conversations, like more that is kind of a cumulative conversation that is not just like an artistic project. So we need to rethink the way we think about creativity and move towards a truly trans-disciplinarity. So abandoning the boundaries of disciplines and creating new paradigms for communicating effectively climate change. So what is exactly transdisciplinarity? Is an approach of integration which dissolves the boundaries between conventional disciplines and organizes teaching and learning around the construction of meanings, new meanings in the context of real world problems or themes. And this is very important. This is the reason why I wanted to, even though we know when we talk about climate change and environmental issues, we know pretty much what we're talking about, but it's important that artists are aware of what they are trying to do. So when we talk about now this new kind of hybrid projects that are led by a thinking that is a transdisciplinary, the questions that are raised are how artists interpret data. So like data usually, especially when you talk with scientists, they have the needs to show evidence, as we were saying before, and not to be misleading or interpretable, while artists, they have to interpret data and give back their own personal view on what's happening. Curators, they have a need to make the artistic work understood and viewed by a large public, so to go even to unusual places. So here we are talking not about the standard exhibition in a museum, we are talking about complete new ways of using public space, or complete new ways to involve the public into this kind of conversation and creation of meanings. Institutions, often they have their own agenda, they have a budget, especially now a lot of institutions have budget to dedicate to public art and to climate change, but sometimes they also have their own political agenda, and sometimes they can't, let's say, they can't expose themselves too much, or depending on the political view you represent, you might be inclined to talk about certain topics or not. Architects and urban planners are fundamental, because sometimes, as curators or whoever works in this field, or artists, we think that everything is possible, but there are a lot of strict restrictions that we need to be aware. And funders and sponsors, which again, at the moment, it feels like it is an area where there is enough sufficient, or in some cases, a lot of budget dedicated to this. Sometimes the sponsors are brands that use art to do greenwashing and other important topics. So how we really combine all these needs that sometimes are completely in contrast, are completely impossible to melt as a way to create these hybrid projects. So how can we really, how can artists really ride the line between art, science and other disciplines while maintaining integrity from all the parts? I would say that This is not exhaustive because we are all learning from these new ways of using art, but I think the key word in the process is responsibility. So if you feel like you want to do something, you feel like you want to really make a change with your art, you need to know, you need to study, you need to know what you're doing. You need to know that you have a responsibility. It's not just like an artistic project that you do for yourself. Another important point is to work towards a shared vision. So all the elements we mentioned before, they need to have a shared vision, otherwise it doesn't really work. And it means like working together, understanding everyone's need, and trying to find a way that emphasizes the knowledge of everyone, and becomes like the sum of the part becomes bigger than the single parts. Of course, knowledge and study is fundamental, and this is something I think on a personal level, it's like abandoning the idea that one area of expertise is more important than the other. For example, abandoning your personal ego. I don't know if we are even talking about artistic projects anymore, even though the outcome is an artistic project, but the work together to arrive to that solution is such a complex, a comprehensive knowledge of all the parts involved that probably we need to find a new name for that. So one important point for artists is what does it mean to work with other needs and visions and objectives for your personal gaze and vision. I think we still need artists and photographers to be truthful and authentic with their own personal vision and motivation, because only if you do that, you can really hope to inspire, engage, and excite people, which again, we need to remind ourselves that this is what we're trying to do, to really inspire people to activate a cultural shift into their lives, or at least, you know, to move something in your brain about the knowledge you have about things. It makes you think, not only take a photo, go home and put it on Instagram. It's just like what we are really asking is really work together to make some changes, to inspire people to make some changes. The end result of this hybrid project, as I said before, it's a sum, a shared vision of all the other skills, knowledges, and work put into place. So it's really a work of a group of people. I found this quote, which I thought it was interesting to share, which is kind of, I said it through the line during my presentation, is that if sustainability or change of climate change become art trends du jour, we risk providing a palliative to ourselves and to our audiences without contributing much to artistic production, nuanced debate, or lasting social change. So it's very important that, of course, now I can see everyone is really jumping on the bandwagon of climate change topic, and it's a good thing in a way, because I don't think anyone at the moment can say that we don't know what's going on. So the more we talk about it, the more we get informed about what, as a public, the public gets informed about what's happening. But you know, if you want to make really a difference, it's not just about as long as we talk about it, but we need to work more on the effectiveness of what we do. So some conclusions: new ways of visualizing our data, hard data, can be quite powerful and eye-opening to the scientific community itself. So it's like sometimes when you work with scientists, they never have imagined that data can be also interpreted and given back to the public in a complete different way, and actually it can be really powerful. An artist's visualization of real climate data doesn't necessarily mean that the data will become easier to understand, but artists have the ability to deepen and challenge a conversation. The role of art in the global climate change movement is to deepen personal engagement with the climate change issues and provide new platforms for deeper reflection and discourse, with or without the intention to catalyze activism. Of course, we want to, but sometimes even, you know, sparkle new conversations could be enough. And of course, the power of collective actions. So integration of disciplines and knowledge can be really strong and useful in activating behavioral changes. I put here some references of some researches interesting I found to kind of support my presentation. And that's it. Thank you. This was my presentation. I will leave the word to David Cross.
I'd like to respond to what Maria Teresa has said by way of introduction. There's a very rich and insightful set of observations you've made, Maria Teresa. And I think that moving away from the straightforward idea of communicating a message to an audience that lacks the knowledge is a really valuable point of view, that we're into a process of transformation which is reciprocal. The complexity of the climate emergency is one part of its confounded difficulty to challenge. But I think our implication within a complex system of dynamic feedback loops is where we reach a new level of understanding. So the old modernist conception of communication, whereby experts who have access to the information and the understanding of what needs to be done communicate that through the channels to a mass of people who are receptive in a relatively straightforward way, has to give way now to a more dialogic, reciprocal model, whereby we acknowledge that our systems of communication carry biases within them, right down to the fundamental aspects of lens-based media, which contain within them the visual technology of perspective, which is something I'd like to speak about if my slides transfer. But then also the institutions of the media, the way that images circulate through the social media, the way that the private media control our access to images, and the way that the overarching economic system focused on growth, that we might call capitalism, controls our attention and focuses us in all kinds of ways which favor the interests of private individuals over the common or the public interest. And so images are operating in a confounded situation whereby the desire to communicate a straight message about an urgent issue, which might be the scientist's agenda, or the desire to make a personal point that attracts attention that might be the artist's agenda, are in constant pressure from these external forces. Not just pressure on people's time and attention span, but a subtle and insistent ideological bias to downplay the nature of the problem, to defer the radical solution, and to deflect attention onto the individual level, whereby we all end up focusing on our personal lifestyle choices rather than on a systemic change, which is so urgently needed. So apparently my slides have transferred to you. If you can access them and share the screen, that'll be a workaround against the paranoid system of control that is the university. It would be a wonderful demonstration of freedom and rebellion against conformity. My involvement with the relationship between visual culture and sustainability goes back many years. It was my reason for going to art school. Back in 1986, I thought the environmental crisis, as it was then called, was so urgent. And I believed that visual communication was the way to get the message out, to help people see what was happening, to envision it, would absolutely be something worth devoting my time to. But ever since then, what I've found is complications and entanglements, refinements and revisions, deeper complexity, and an endless deferral of the moment when people finally realize how fragile the planetary ecosystem is and how incompatible it is with the profound model, the pursuit of growth that's the defining characteristic of capitalism. So I've become an anti-capitalist over the years. I wasn't at the outset, but over time I have become so. And that's my ideological bias in a way. I think that we do need to focus on the common and public spheres, which have been marginalized by the dominance of the private sphere. Oh, that's fantastic. You've got the slides there. If you could just go onto full screen, that would be fantastic. What I've been interested in is that visualizing the environmental emergency can help us to understand our relationship to the emergency, not simply understand the emergency as a thing separate from ourselves. And by understanding how we relate to it, that's the way, hopefully, that we can begin to change it. And the way that images position the viewer can influence the sense of self which in turn can influence how people don't just passively receive messages, they actively participate in the creation of meaning. So visualization happens as an exchange between people and also within them, connecting the internal world of memory and imagination with the external world of material phenomena and social processes. As a cultural practice, visualization spans the cognitive, the affective, the psychological, and the ideological aspects of experience. In this slide, it's a diagram dated 1538. Albrecht Dürer sets out his understanding of two fundamental elements of perspective: the sight line converging with the ground plane. But the figure is what interests me in Dürer's diagram. And this is a white male of the European Enlightenment holding an instrument for dividing metric space. And I think he personifies the ambiguous nature of perspective. On the one hand, perspective affirms the existence of reality outside ourselves, but it does so in a way that expands the sphere of the ego to the scale of the planet. Next slide, please. In the 17th century, René Descartes developed the dualistic conception of mind and matter. And this was one of a series of binary separations in Western thinking. I'm no scholar of Derrida, so I'll just say that in 1982, Fritjof Capra diagnosed the cultural effect of these binary separations as what he called a crisis of perception. Next slide, please. Capra related the split between mind and body in Western medicine to the reductionist analysis of living systems, which focuses on their smallest functional units. Next, please. In reductionist thinking and in the mechanistic model of the universe, Capra saw misrecognitions which drive conflict, ecological destruction, and physical and mental illness. Next, please. Capra was influenced by Gregory Bateson, who related insights from psychology, anthropology, and systems theory to identify interconnected networks of the human, the society, and the ecosystem. Next, please. Bateson focused on how these networks are all characterized by non-linear causality and dynamic feedback loops. What I'd like to do now, though, is tell you about just one project from my artistic collaboration as Cornford and Cross. Matthew Cornford and I made over 40 art projects, which involved working with other disciplines, including aviation, engineering, history, neuroscience, and economics. So I'm just going to show you one, which is titled The Abolition of Work. Next, please. It was commissioned for the new Exchange Gallery in Penzance, which is an area of high unemployment and social inequality. All around Cornwall are many historic relics from the days of mining for copper and tin, extractive industries that collapsed as resources were used up or production was transferred to colonized countries. Next, please. The Exchange Gallery opened in 2007 as a centre for cultural activity, and the ambition was that this would lead the economic regeneration of the town. The gallery is named after the former use of the building as a telephone exchange. Next, please. As a telephone exchange, the building would have been full of copper cabling to carry telephone calls. As we all know, the main use of copper is as a conduit for water, electricity, and telecommunications. Next, please. Copper and tin have also been historically important as a means of exchange. Today's 1 penny coin in Britain was initially minted in 1971 from bronze, which is an alloy of copper and tin. It's the lowest denomination of currency in the UK and almost worthless. Next, please. We asked for our artist's fee and production budget to be combined and delivered to the gallery in 1 penny coins. Next, please. By laying out 1 metre square of the pennies, we calculated the surface area that the coins would cover, but we could only guess how much time it would take to lay them out, so we just had to make a start. Next, please. With a small team of helpers, we started placing the pennies by hand on the gallery floor. Next, please. Although repetitive, the task called for more skill and patience than we had expected. As the days went by, it became clear we were running late. Next, please. The word went out around the town, and members of the public called in to help lay the coins as volunteers. Even the gallery director joined us. That's him at the back in a blue shirt. Next, please. We titled the piece "The Abolition of Work" after a pamphlet by the anarchist Bob Black, who writes that he proposes the complete transformation of society towards a way of life based entirely on play. Next one, please. As we were making this project, news was coming in of a crisis in the global financial system. And this cartoon from the Financial Times reminded me of the old practice in Cornwall of luring ships in onto the rocks so that they would become wrecks and then their treasure could be taken. Next slide, please. When de-installing the piece after the show, the gallery technician came up with this brilliant method of collecting the coins simply by sucking them up into a vacuum cleaner. Once the coins were safely back in the bank, the gallery director telephoned me at home to say that, well, there had been an overspend with the previous exhibition, and so he hoped I would understand if the gallery needed to keep the money to balance their accounts. Next slide, please. In 2012, Raven Row Gallery held an exhibition of the work of the Artists Placement Group, or APG. Next slide, please. As part of the programme, I was invited to host a discussion, linking the Artist Placement Group themes of placement and education, and following my colleague Hayley Newman's brilliant project as self-appointed artist in residence in the City of London. I designated my academic post at the University of the Arts London as an artist's placement, and I gave myself a remit to engage with the social ecological crisis. Next, please. In 2013, our Vice-Chancellor, Nigel Carrington, signed the People and Planet Green Education Pledge, committing UAL to work towards a greener higher education sector. I wrote to congratulate him and to urge rapid action to keep up with the students. I sent him summaries of the latest research connecting climate breakdown to financial instability, and I alerted him to the financial risks of fossil fuels as stranded assets. He didn't answer, but I kept going, and I warned him of the risks, the reputational risks, particularly of banking, next slide please, with the Royal Bank of Scotland. UAL deposited tuition fees from students with RBS, which in turn lent the money out to make profit. Next please. RBS had branded itself as the oil and gas bank, aggressively investing billions of pounds into power companies and fossil fuel extraction, including mountaintop removal for open cast coal mines. Next, please. They also invested heavily in shale gas through hydraulic fracturing or fracking. Next, please. Perhaps worst of all was their heavy investment in oil sands extraction in Alberta, Canada. Next, please. In 2013 and 2014, I gave lectures across the university and elsewhere connecting art, climate change and finance, proposing that UAL should switch banks and divest from fossil fuels. A number of students came forward and we formed a campaign group called Fossil Free UAL. The group submitted a Freedom of Information request asking how much money UAL had invested in fossil fuels, and then they posted a petition online. Next, please. UAL fossil-free students staged a die-in at Central St. Martin's. Poised between defiance and capitulation, their action complemented evidence and reasoned argument for divestment with a powerful psychological effect. In a place where they were well known, the students' gesture as a minority was to take a position of symbolic vulnerability on the unstable border between art and activism. Next, please. In November 2015, UAL announced that it would divest its endowments of £3.9 million from fossil fuels and sign the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment. We were delighted, as it seemed to show that staff and students can work together, and that art practice informed by scientific research can have an actual effect. Next, please. With my colleagues, Margot Bannerman, a lecturer in fine art, and Claire Farrell, a founder member of Extinction Rebellion, we staged a series of open meetings across the university to discuss what we should do about the climate crisis as artists and educators. And in September 2019, UAL declared that it is responding to the climate emergency. Next, please. Supported by Professor Jeremy Till and facilitated by Kate Pellin, we called climate assemblies across UAL. Next one, please. I led one of the working groups, and I pointed out that our university's business model is based on expansion projects financed by international recruitment, which massively increases our carbon emissions from air travel. And I proposed that UAL now needs a new business model that connects ecological regeneration with social justice through what we do best, cultural transformation. Next, please. I quoted the UK government's Committee on Climate Change, which recommended that if we're going to reach net zero carbon emissions, we will have to invest a minimum of between 1% and 2% of gross domestic product. I contacted the British Office for National Statistics, and they confirmed that gross domestic product can be related proportionately to the total added value of a university. I don't know if you can see, but have I lost connection with you? I don't know.
No.
Oh, I can't see anything. Everything's gone.
We can hear you. We can still hear you. And you can still see your slides as well.
We are at the slide. There is a number. No, to reach net zero CO2 and invest 1-2% of GDP.
Ah, okay, that's brilliant. Because if UAL invested this money, 1 or 2%, that's all of its total added value, that would provide several £million every year for tackling the climate emergency. And if you, are we on a graph now, a circular graph?
Yes.
Okay, on the circular graph, there's two parts, a red part and a blue part. The red is for European students' fees, and the blue part is for international students. You put them together, and we see that 77% of our university's income comes from student fees. So I proposed that students should be involved in deciding how the money should be invested. This might include research, scholarships, and live projects to reimagine what an art school could be in the age of climate breakdown. Next slide, please. But when COVID-19 struck, we lost our energy and the focus was dissipated. Professor Jeremy Till set up an official UAL Climate Emergency Network, an online platform for staff and students to share ideas about how to tackle the climate emergency. And with Professors Dilys Williams as co-chair, he formed a new climate and ecological action group. As a member of that group, I argued that tackling the climate emergency is not just about cutting carbon emissions in order to save the Western way of life, but it's about a deeper and more complex project of climate justice. And that means working at the convergence of decolonization and decarbonisation. Next slide, please. Decarbonisation is an unprecedented historical task of ending all carbon emissions and removing carbon from the atmosphere. I advocated that to do this, UAL should apply science-based targets to cut our carbon emissions to zero. Science-based targets aren't just about carbon. They also enable organizations to reverse the loss of nature in line with the latest science, to stabilize the climate, preserve fresh water, regenerate land, protect oceans, and support biodiversity. It's a method for showing how this can be done. Amazingly, my proposal was approved, and science-based targets are now a key part of our university's climate action plan. Next slide, please. Actually, jump 2. We're onto a graph now. Are we onto a graph of emission reduction pathways?
Yes, David.
Okay, Science-based targets enable organizations not just to aim to cut emissions to zero, but to plan a pathway to achieve it. This schematic chart by Ketan Joshi shows why the emissions reduction pathway is crucial. It's not good enough just to get to net zero. You've got to get there soon. All these pathways here eventually reach zero emissions by the given year, in this case, 2050. At the top is the emissions reduction pathway of business as usual. At the bottom is the reduction pathway of deep and early cuts in fossil fuel use. Next slide, please. Making deep and early cuts in fossil fuel use achieves total decarbonisation while staying within the global carbon budget. Next slide, please. In contrast, by delaying action, business as usual overshoots the global carbon budget, causing economic and ecological collapse. As Bill McKibben of climate campaign 350.org said, winning slowly is the same as losing. Next slide, please. The global carbon budget is the limit agreed by the world's scientific community for how much carbon can be emitted while avoiding uncontrollable climate breakdown. And that limit is calculated by adding up all carbon emissions from burning fossil fuels or cutting down trees, and then subtracting all the carbon which is absorbed by the world's forests, soils, and oceans. Next slide, please. Staying within the global carbon budget is not simply a technical matter of measurement and calculation, though. As Andrew Sterling wrote many years ago, calculation must be subordinate to judgment. On the Old Bailey courts in London, the allegorical figure of justice holds scales, symbolizing the weighing of evidence and the balancing of competing claims. Next slide, please. Advocates for fossil fuels claim that planting trees, protecting soils, and restoring mangroves will lock up the carbon from burning fossil fuels. Now, they're partly right, because that does happen to some extent. But science shows that biological carbon sinks cannot offset the sheer quantity of fossil fuel combustion. Fossil carbon and biological carbon also are not interchangeable, as they work on completely different timescales. Fossil carbon has lain undisturbed deep underground for millions of years. But ecosystems can only absorb carbon for short timescales, and then they can quickly re-release it back into the atmosphere, such as when a forest burns. Carbon offsets confuse basic science by wrongly treating the Earth's atmosphere as a sink for fossil carbon emissions. Carbon offsetting schemes also perpetrate injustice by taking land out of food production and by displacing indigenous and local people. Next slide, please. As the global economy rebounds after the COVID pandemic, there's been a vast upsurge in carbon emissions, and tackling that demands international cooperation and transdisciplinary thinking. But our hopes to build back better from the pandemic have just been derailed by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, revealing once again how deeply energy, power, and force are interwoven with civilian life. Next slide, please. Western sanctions against Russia's oil and gas exports contributed to a surge in price over the last few weeks, and this has driven the cost of living crisis even higher. Having delayed the decarbonising of energy systems, our governments, industry and finance then rushed to secure oil and gas supplies for the short term, and that drove prices even higher and poured investment into the fossil fuel companies who've spent it straight away on extracting even more fossil fuels. You couldn't make it up. Next slide, please. A key tenet of climate justice is that climate breakdown hits hardest and soonest on the people who have done least to cause it. And these are the vulnerable and marginalized communities of the global south, who not only did the least to cause the damage, but they're also least equipped to cope with its effects. And the reason that they're least equipped is not some accident of history. It's the result of having been systematically dispossessed by colonialism. Next slide, please. This has happened since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. In his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, Walter Rodney wrote that James Watt who invented the steam engine, expressed eternal gratitude to the West Indian slave owners who directly financed his famous steam engine and took it from the drawing board to the factory. Next slide, please. British and European colonizers used slave labor and steam power to deforest landscapes for monoculture plantations of cash crops. And doing this devastated whole ecosystems and the lives of the people who depended on them. Next slide, please. London's dominance as a global financial centre was built on its accumulation of wealth as capital of the British Empire, which was powered by slave labour and fossil fuels. And right now, the deregulated systems of the City of London are channeling vast sums of money from around the world into projects that will push the planet to ecological collapse unless we can find a way to deflect that. Next slide, please. The distribution of risks and benefits from fossil fuels is completely unjust. This graph from the Statistical Review of World Energy by British Petroleum shows energy consumption not by country, but per capita by region. Now, first, I'd like you to look at the green line at the top, which shows energy consumption in North America. Now, what's extraordinary about this graph, though, is at the bottom, the red line, which shows energy consumption in Africa. I have to say, I've never seen a line like this on a graph, and it's one of the most important lines on the most important graphs I can imagine. Next slide, please. Of course, the fastest and fairest way to avoid climate collapse would be for the wealthy to consume less. But that's unthinkable under capitalism, which is based on extreme inequality and the fantasy of infinite growth. Now, if market forces prevail, decarbonisation will mean the hasty development of systems to generate, store and transmit renewable energy. And that will mean extracting vast quantities of construction materials such as aluminium, concrete and steel, plus critical metals such as cobalt, lithium and nickel. Next slide, please. As the London Mining Network has shown, the extraction of minerals for the transition to a post-carbon economy and society continues the grim history of colonialism, which enriches people who are already rich, while dispossessing local and indigenous communities, and of course, wrecking fragile ecosystems. Next slide, please. For climate justice to be legitimate, its procedures must give a fair hearing to marginalized peoples. Last year, Ecuador's indigenous movement hosted judges from the country's highest court for a historic hearing deep in the indigenous territory of Amazonia. The judge's task was to decide whether the state would uphold its own constitution by recognizing the rights of indigenous peoples to self-determination and the rights of nature, the rights of rivers, forests, mountains, and animals to exist without threats of contamination or destruction. Next slide, please. This is a rare piece of good news. In December 2021, the 7 justices of the Constitutional Court of Ecuador made a landmark ruling which affirmed those rights, and not just in protected areas, but across the whole country. This ruling upends the conception of nature as property, and it requires a new form of citizen coexistence in diversity and harmony with nature. Okay, well, I've shown you some material which I've borrowed from the disciplines of economics, politics, geography, science, history, and law, but which I believe concern the university and the art school and the professions of the people that learn in them. A transdisciplinary approach could bring this material together, not only to visualize the social ecological emergency, but also, I hope, to envision scenarios of a possible world beyond it. If working across disciplines is a journey into the uncertain territory of the imagination, then maybe the creative practices of art and design can make the path by walking it. Thanks very much for listening.
I suppose it's a very difficult question to answer, but I guess to David, I think people are almost paralyzed with almost fear about what they can do, and this sort of, as you said, this dichotomy between relatively small scale interventions we can make individually and the massive interventions that need to be made socially to be able to create this any kind of realistic response to the climate emergency. I mean, I'm not asking you for an answer, but you know, what is your sense of what can an individual do, if anything? Is it better to put our time into lobbying, joining groups, you know, trying to make some kind of positive change, or some more passive activities like, you know, giving up meat or using the car less? But what is the best way to spend our time, as it were, and our resources to actually affect change?
That's a brilliant question. Personally, I started with the individual actions. I gave up my car, gave up my motorbike, in a sequence of renunciations. I stopped using a mobile phone, even at paranoia, at surveillance capitalism. I cut up my credit card. I paid off all my debts. I stopped eating meat. I just ride a bicycle, just loads of stuff. Oh, and then in 2005, I gave up jet travel. And so I stopped my career effectively, because it's a requirement to be an international artist that you've got to be able to jet off to take part in exhibitions. And I thought, I love it. I love it so much. And I really don't want to give it up. But on the other hand, now that I know that what I'm doing is unsustainable, either I've got to stop talking about sustainability and the ecological crisis, or I have to match my actions with what I know to be true, because I can't live the contradiction. So finally, with a heavy heart, I gave up jet travel in 2005. And I thought the world would end, but it didn't. It carried on, and I'm still here. So the interesting thing is that although individual actions are not enough, a theory of change can accept that the personal transformations we make help us view the world in a different way and help us judge and get a sense of scale. Like if you know how long it takes to walk 10 kilometers, you then appreciate like how much quicker it is by bike. And so knowing how much I can achieve individually helps me appreciate how much more I could appreciate how much more we could do if we were to work collaboratively. So I don't see a split between individual actions and collective action. I think they support each other in a reciprocal feedback loop. But I do think we're running out of time. I know that time under modernity is linear, and that doesn't fit with the multiple layered narratives of indigenous conceptions of time, but I still think that it really is urgent now. We're right up to the edge of triggering uncontrollable climate emergency, and almost anything people do is better than nothing. So stopping meat, which was kept out of the press for many years, is a really good thing you can do. It's better for your health anyway. And also, if you ever visit an animal farm, it's off-putting. You're not going to want to eat much meat after you've seen an industrial protein factory. It's not quite the farm that we're presented in the advertisements. So stopping meat would be a brilliant thing to do. Reduce your fossil fuel consumption as far as you can, switch banks. There's a load of practical things, and each one of them now is not just an individual action, it's part of a network of transformation. And you'll find that there's loads of people out there welcoming you on board, offering support and advice to take it further, and giving you encouragement about how important it is and what it means. And that's, I think, what gives us the basis for then turning to our institutions and saying, come on, we've done our bit, it's time for you now to help us. You're in charge of millions or hundreds of millions of pounds. We've switched bank, you could switch bank too. So I think it strengthens the possibility of collective action. And as long as it doesn't act as a distraction from collectivity, then individual action has an enormous contribution to make.
Yeah, if I can add something, totally agree with David. I think we have to really overcome this narration by which individuals cannot make a difference, because all the corporations and politicians, policymakers, like big influencers, they live out of social consensus. So the point is creating a critical mass of people really aware. And of course, David was focusing on the individual as like a life being in this world, and as artists instead, and here I connect to the first questions in the Q&A by Archana Sharma from India. which it's a very important point, because we don't have to just have the ambition of creating a big, massive projects that go on the main media and really are talked about all around the world. Because the influence, everyone as an artist, if you are authentic, if you study, if you work with other disciplines as well, have somehow the ability to influence your circle. So even if it's a small project, but it arrives to the right people in your local community, that of course, as we were saying in the previous presentation I had before, like the localization is becoming the most important thing to do. So knowing your local reality. So if we talk about the problems in India, we are not credible because we don't know exactly what's going on. But Indian artists that need to deal with some issues that have to do with the lack of food is something that is relevant to your community. So with photography, you can do some pressing campaigns to the local politicians or ONGs, or, sorry, in English is NGOs. So everyone has to put their own skills, ability, network, knowledge at the service of a bigger vision and objective. This big doesn't mean worldwide, doesn't mean global, doesn't mean it's good for everyone. It means that it has an influence in your community. So I hope, Archana, I replied to your question, but you need to work with your local people in order to produce projects to be helped by who can spread your work in your community, and in a way try to make some pressure on local politicians in order to help improve the situation. So I think the principle is applies to everyone, but we don't have to. Sometimes, you know, Paul was saying sometimes we are blocked because we don't know what to do, because the issue seems so big that we don't know where to start from. So apart as a human being, there is a lot of things we can do, and David mentioned a few. As artists, we have an even bigger ability to inspire and influence people around us.
One thing I would suggest is have a look at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Terrible graphics, horrible sort of universal isotypes, which don't communicate well, but the principles of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals are brilliant. And they've been agreed by all the nations on Earth through the distorted mechanism of the international negotiating system. But one of the great things about them is that they recognize that they're not all in harmony with each other. That if we want to promote the education of young women, for example, and we also want to increase electrification so everyone has electric light, it's possible that two goals can clash, or that one of them needs to take priority over another. And so we end up with situations where sometimes they work together. Planting trees also helps stabilize soil and clean air and provide local food. So there's a co-benefits, but in other cases, there's trade-offs. And so they've got a mechanism for looking at synergies and trade-offs, and understanding that kind of complexity is what artists do. They don't simply communicate simple messages. This is good, you know, buy this product. It's not advertising. It's not propaganda. Art has a different function, which is to enable people to recognize complexity and to bring values to a particular situation. So I think the complexity of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals are absolutely the guidance that we need to say what's important, but it doesn't tell us what to do. It tells us about potential synergies and potential trade-offs, which as artists we could approach in a rich and nuanced way.
Maria-Teresa, could you maybe just share that last slide you had with your references, by the way? Apologies for not spotting it, because I know I saw you were sharing some slides and I think I missed the transition when you stopped showing, but maybe just share that last slide.
I just shared all the links.
Oh, you did? Fantastic.
Yeah. I don't know if everyone can see them, because I replied directly to Gabriella Bulisova. Is there a way I can share all the links with everyone?
You can put them in the chat box, or I can do that for you. Hang on, I'll send them to everybody. Great. Well, I think, you know, we've already gone a little bit over time. I think in a way, David, you responded to the other question as well, because you've kind of talked about how it has to be a very arts job is not necessarily to directly confront specific instances of problems like in the global lobby in Alberta, but it's to provide this kind of parallel reality or parallel space where we can engage with these questions in a different kind of register almost. So I think in a way that kind of responds quite well to the, which in a sense is also a way to respond to this kind of overwhelming sense that what can we do? I think what we can do is find different and alternative and creative ways to engage with these issues in a from the side, as it were, or in oblique ways, as well as confronting them directly. Hopefully everybody's got those links for the
there is a question from
mentioned.
Ted, Paul.
Well, that's kind of what I was addressing just then.
Okay.
I said I felt like David's response about, the role of art in a way responded to that question. I think, perhaps the role of art is not to directly confront global corporations. All of that is one role, but I think there are other ways in which it can provide resistance and provide interventions and so on.
Yeah, I would say already our artists live a way of life which is not immediately possible to recuperate and commodify. The way artists don't always fit in or conform. The act of being creative is already to propose that things could be different and better. So holding on to that is already a massive contribution to the complex challenges we face. Yeah,
I think it's showing us there are different possibilities and different ways of doing things, isn't it? And it's opening up that parallel, or almost like a parallel reality, as I said earlier on, showing that things don't have to be the way they can be, that they are now. We can imagine a different future or imagine a different way to move forward in the world.
Yeah, we must,
wonderful.
I guess.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for the great session, as always, really thought-provoking. And thank you both, Maria-Teresa and David, for some really, really complex ideas explained in a really clear and coherent way, and some great, very practical steps about what we can do in our lives to try to move ourselves at least forward on that line. This is the last of our sessions for the moment. We'll take a break over the summer. We'll be coming back hopefully with some more of these sessions in the autumn. Thank you all very, very much for being with us. Thank you very much to Seven Insider and to Photo Wings, and also, as Maria-Teresa said, thank you to Everything is Connected and Photography in the Archive Research Centre, University of the Arts London, for supporting these series of talks. Keep the conversation going. Thank you very much for taking part today, and thank you as always to Seven Insider for kindly hosting us today. Thank you very much, David. And
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Ciao, ciao.
Ciao.